I'll never forget the face of Officer Martinez when he stepped into my living room that night with his hat in his hands. His eyes couldn't seem to meet mine. They darted from my walker to the framed photos of my grandchildren to the oxygen tank beside my armchair. Anywhere but at me. "Miss Eleanor," he finally said, "we know." Just 2 words, but they made my old heart flutter like a trapped bird. 93 years on this earth, and I'd finally been caught. I reached for my teacup to steady myself, but my hand betrayed me with its trembling. The fine china rattled against the saucer. "Know what, young man?" I asked, injecting as much grandmotherly confusion into my voice as I could muster. But we both knew the game was up. For 8 months, I'd been vanishing from Golden Sunset Retirement Community every night between midnight and 3 a.m. And now, apparently they'd followed me. I wondered which part shocked them more, what this old body was capable of, or where I'd been going. Let me back up a bit and tell you how this all started. Pour yourself another cup of tea, because this part still makes my blood simmer even now. I wasn't always the kind of woman who sneaks out in the middle of the night like some teenage rebel. Lord knows, for most of my life I was the one enforcing the rules. For 42 years I was Eleanor Jenkins, respected high school principal at Millfield High, the first black woman to hold the position, wife of the beloved Reverend Thomas Jenkins of First Baptist, mother of 3 children who'd all gone on to professional careers, grandmother of 8 brilliant grandchildren whose photos crowded every surface of my home. I'd lived in Millfield for 62 years, taught half the town, watched it change, grow, and sometimes backslide. That house on Maple Street meant everything to me. Everything. You had to understand what it took for Thomas and me to buy it back in 1961. We'd been saving every penny for 5 years. Him preaching, me teaching, living in his parents' cramped apartment, putting aside money when most folks said we should just stay in our place. When that old Victorian farmhouse came on the market, it was run down and neglected. Paint peeling, porch sagging, garden overgrown with weeds. But Lord, it had bones. Beautiful bones. High ceilings, hardwood floors, a grand staircase that made me feel like I was in one of those movies white folks always got to star in. The realtor hadn't wanted to show it to us. "There are more appropriate neighborhoods for your people," he'd said, not quite meeting our eyes. But Thomas, my sweet, stubborn Thomas, had simply smiled that smile of his that could melt ice in January and said, "We'd like to see the house, sir. We have the money." When we moved in, some neighbors moved out. Others kept their distance. A few kids threw eggs at our porch one Halloween. But we just kept on living. Planted roses and tomatoes. Fixed the sagging steps. Hosted Sunday dinners after church where anyone was welcome at our table. Over the years, that house became more than wood and plaster. It was where I wiped away tears when Martin Luther King was shot, where we celebrated when Obama was elected, where Thomas drew his last breath 5 years ago, holding my hand and telling me to keep on keeping on. After Thomas died, the house felt too big some days, too quiet. But it was mine. My domain. My history. Every scratch on the doorframe marking our children's heights. Every dent in the kitchen table from homework done under pressure. Every creak in the 3rd stair that we never fixed because it served as an alarm system when the kids tried sneaking out. All of it was written in a language only I could fully read. So when Marcus started his campaign to get me to move into Golden Sunset, I resisted. For months, I resisted. "Mom," he'd say during his weekly Sunday visits, "I worry about you alone in this big house. What if you fall? What if something happens at night?" "I've got neighbors," I'd counter. "Mrs. Rodriguez checks on me every morning. Pastor Williams calls twice a week." "But they're not medical professionals," he'd argue. "Golden Sunset has nurses on staff 24/7. And you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or cooking." "I like cooking," I'd snap. "Keeps my hands nimble." We went round and round like this for almost a year. But I noticed his visits getting shorter, his calls less frequent. He was wearing down. Or wearing me down. And if I'm being honest with myself, there were days when the stairs seemed steeper, the garden more demanding. The turning point came after I caught a bad case of pneumonia last winter. Spent 2 weeks in the hospital, Marcus or one of his sisters sitting vigil at my bedside. My oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low one night. The doctor said later it was a close call. When I finally came home, Marcus was waiting with brochures from Golden Sunset. But this time he had a new approach. "Mom," he said, sitting at my kitchen table, his fingers tracing the pattern in the wood, "I've been thinking a lot about what should happen to the house. It's too special to just sell to strangers." I perked up a bit, curious. "You know how you've always talked about the neighborhood needing a safe place for kids after school? I've been talking to some people on the city council about turning the house into a community center. The Jenkins Community Center." He smiled, seeming genuinely excited. "They could keep the gardens, use the big living room for classes, maybe add a computer lab upstairs. Your legacy would live on, helping the next generation." I won't lie, the idea appealed to me. I'd spent my life in education, trying to give children, especially black and brown children, the tools and safe spaces they needed to thrive. The thought of my home becoming a continuation of that work, well, it felt right. And what would happen to me? I asked, still wary. "You'd move to Golden Sunset, where you'd have care and company. But you'd be on the advisory board for the community center. You could visit anytime, see it taking shape, guide its development." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, please. After Dad died, you made me promise to look after you. Let me keep that promise." I studied my son's face, the gray threading through his temples, the lines around his eyes that reminded me so much of his father. He was 57 years old with grown children of his own. Yet in that moment, I saw the earnest little boy who'd brought home stray kittens and asked if we could please keep them. "Let me think about it," I said finally. And I did think. For days, I walked through each room of my house, running my hands over the wallpaper Thomas and I had hung together, looking out windows that had framed 60 years of seasons. I sat on the porch swing where I'd nursed all 3 of my babies, where I'd graded thousands of papers, where Thomas and I had watched countless sunsets in comfortable silence. Could I really leave all this? But then again, if it meant the house would continue to shelter and nurture children who needed it, wasn't that the best possible outcome? A week later, I called Marcus and told him I'd agree, but with conditions. I wanted in writing, legal writing, that the house will become a community center. I want to be involved in the planning. And I want a guarantee that I can visit whenever I want. "Of course, Mom," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll have papers drawn up right away." 2 months later, I moved into Golden Sunset Retirement Community, a sprawling complex of tidy apartments and communal spaces on the north side of town. My new residence was clean, functional, and utterly devoid of character. Beige walls, beige carpet, furniture that looked like it had been ordered in bulk from a catalog titled, "Appropriate for the Elderly." The staff was pleasant enough in that professionally cheerful way that makes you wonder what they say about you when you're not in the room. Most of the other residents were white. I was one of only 3 black residents in a facility of over 100 seniors. But I'd spent most of my professional life being the first, or the only, so that didn't faze me much. What I didn't expect was Director Phillips. A man perhaps 50 years old with salt and pepper hair always perfectly coiffed, expensive suits that seemed at odds with running a retirement facility, and a way of speaking to residents that set my teeth on edge. "Ms. Jenkins, here at Golden Sunset, we prioritize safety above all else," he said during my orientation, enunciating each word as if speaking to a child with a hearing impairment. "That means our residents must be in their rooms by 9 p.m. No exceptions." I'd raised my eyebrow at him. "Young man, I've been setting my own bedtime since before your mother was born." His plastic smile didn't waver. "It's policy, Ms. Jenkins. For your safety." I quickly learned that "for your safety" was Phillips' catch-all justification for rules that seemed designed to infantilize and control. We couldn't keep food in our rooms, for your safety. As if I hadn't been preparing meals for myself for 80 years. We couldn't have candles, for your safety. Never mind that I'd never so much as singed a curtain in all my years. We had to sign in and out, even for a walk around the grounds, for your safety, in case we wandered off like toddlers, I supposed. I chafed under these restrictions but tried to adapt. I focused instead on my weekly visits to my old house, where Marcus assured me plans for the community center were progressing. Each time I visited, Marcus would drive me there, walk through the rooms with me, And tell me about meetings with architects and community organizers. They're going to preserve the front parlor just as it is, he'd say. The kids can use it as a reading room. And they love the idea of keeping Mom's victory garden for teaching about sustainable food. I'd nod, running my hand over the mantelpiece, checking that the brass plaque commemorating Thomas's 25th year as pastor was still in its place. Things seemed dustier than I would have allowed, and occasionally I noticed small items missing. The crystal paperweight Thomas had given me for our 40th anniversary, the hand-carved chess set my father had made, but Marcus assured me they were just being stored safely during the transition. I wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was that I'd made a terrible mistake. And then came the day, 3 months into my stay at Golden Sunset, when the truth crashed down like a hammer. I was sitting in the common room, trying to focus on a book while half listening to the inane game show blaring on the television. My hearing aids picked up voices from the director's office across the hall, Phillips and someone else. I wouldn't have paid attention except I heard my name mentioned. The Jenkins property is perfect, Phillips was saying, voice carrying despite his attempt to speak quietly. Once we acquire it, we can expand Golden Sunset to double capacity. My head snapped up. My property? Expand Golden Sunset? What about the community center proposal? A woman's voice asked. There was a lot of support for that. I recognized the voice then, Councilwoman Diane Henderson. She'd been one of my students, class of '89. Bright girl, though with a tendency to take shortcuts when she thought no one was looking. I stood up slowly, moving closer to the office door, which was slightly ajar. Phillips laughed, a short, dismissive sound. That was never going to happen. Just a story to get the old woman to sell. Look, we've already got preliminary approval from zoning. The old house will be demolished next month. And Ms. Jenkins knows about this? Henderson asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Not enough concern to actually do the right thing, I noted, but enough to cover herself. Of course not, Phillips replied impatiently. That old woman sold the place to her son, who sold it to us. It's a done deal. We just need your vote on the zoning change next week. My teacup clattered onto its saucer. The sound must have alerted them, because Phillips's door swung open fully, revealing him and Henderson seated at his desk over what appeared to be architectural plans. Ms. Jenkins, Phillips said smoothly, rising to his feet. Can I help you with something? I stared at him, then at Henderson. She at least had the decency to look ashamed, her eyes dropping away from mine. Miss Henderson, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I taught you better than this. Miss Jenkins, she said, finally meeting my gaze. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. I cut her off. You're part of this theft. Phillips stepped forward, his professional smile firmly in place. Ms. Jenkins, I think you might be confused. Why don't we call your son to come pick you up? You seem tired. I drew myself up to my full height, all 5 feet and 2 inches of it. I am not confused, young man. And I am not tired. I am furious. Before either of them could respond, I turned and walked away as steadily as my arthritic legs would allow. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me stumble or hurry. Dignity was often the only weapon left to people like me. Back in my room, I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking with rage and betrayal. I called Marcus. Straight to voicemail. I texted him. Come see me right away. I know what you did. Then I called my youngest daughter, Lydia, who lived in Boston. She'd always been the fiercest of my children, the one most like me. Mama, she answered on the second ring. Everything okay? I took a deep breath. No, baby, everything is not okay. I need you to tell me the truth. Did your brother sell my house to Golden Sunset? A long pause. Then, he said he talked to you about it. That you agreed it was for the best. My heart constricted. So the betrayal went deeper than I'd thought. And the community center? Was that ever real? Another pause. Marcus mentioned something about that falling through. Zoning issues, I think he said. Her voice sharpened. Mama, what's going on? Your brother lied to me, I said simply. He promised me my home would become a community center. Instead, he sold it to these people who plan to tear it down and expand this prison they've put me in. That can't be right, Lydia said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Marcus wouldn't. He would and he did. I cut her off. I just overheard the director talking about it. They're demolishing the house next month. I'm coming down there, Lydia said immediately. I can get a flight tomorrow. No, I said firmly. Not yet. Let me talk to your brother first. I want to hear him say it to my face. After we hung up, I sat in my chair by the window, watching the sun set over the manicured grounds of Golden Sunset. The beauty of it seemed like a mockery now. I thought about my real home, the cobbled-together, imperfect, history-soaked home I'd been tricked into leaving. I thought about Thomas, about what he would say if he were here. Stand tall, he'd tell me, and remember whose child you are. I was still sitting there when Marcus arrived 2 hours later, his expression a mix of concern and wariness. He knocked softly on my open door. Mom, you wanted to see me? I didn't turn from the window. Did you ever actually talk to anyone about making my house a community center? He stepped into the room but kept his distance. Mama, a simple yes or no will do, Marcus. He sighed heavily. No. But Mom, you have to understand. Now I turned to face him, and whatever he saw in my eyes made him stop mid-sentence. I understand perfectly, I said, my voice low and controlled. You lied to me. You manipulated me into giving up my home. The home your father and I built, the home where you grew up, so you could sell it to these people. I gestured around me at the sterile walls of my Golden Sunset apartment. Mom, I had to, he stammered, his eyes pleading. The medical bills from Dad's last year. Your care here. I didn't have a choice. And there it was. The excuse I'd heard from him his entire life. Always the path of least resistance. Always someone else to blame. There's always a choice, I said, and the weight of my disappointment seemed to physically push him back. Your father and I taught you that. Or at least, we tried to. Marcus ran a hand over his face. It was a good offer, Mom. More than the house is worth in today's market. That house is worth everything, I said, feeling the tears I'd been holding back begin to well up. Not in dollars and cents, but in memories. In legacy. In promise. I'm sorry, he said, and I could see he meant it. But being sorry after the fact had always been Marcus's pattern. Sorry after breaking a window with a baseball. Sorry after crashing the car he'd been forbidden to drive. Sorry after dropping out of college with 1 semester left. Always sorry never changed. How much? I asked. What? How much did you sell my house for? He named a figure that made me blink in surprise. It was indeed substantial. Far more than what the property should have commanded, even in a good market. And what did you do with that money, Marcus? He looked away. Some of it went to your care here. And the rest? Silence stretched between us. I already knew. Marcus had always had expensive tastes and poor impulse control. A dangerous combination. You know what hurts the most? I finally said. Not that you sold the house. Not even that you lied about the community center. It's that you knew what that house meant to me. What your father and I went through to get it. What it represented for our family. For our community. Marcus sank into the chair opposite mine, his shoulders slumped. I didn't think. No, you didn't, I agreed. You didn't think about anyone but yourself. Just like always. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Perhaps I had, in a way. Can I do anything? He asked, his voice small. To make it right? I studied him, this middle-aged man who was still, in so many ways, a child looking for the easy way out. My son, whom I loved despite everything. But love didn't mean blindness. I don't know if this can be made right, I said honestly. But you can start by telling me everything. Who approached you? When did you sell? What exactly are they planning to do? And so he did. Haltingly at first, then in a rush. As if confessing brought relief. How Phillips had approached him 6 months ago. Even before I moved in. How the initial community center idea had been Phillips's suggestion. To help convince her. But was never intended to happen. How the money had indeed been substantial. But how Marcus had already spent much of it on a new car. Some investments that hadn't panned out. And paying off credit card debt. With each word, my heart hardened a little more. Not just toward my son, but toward Phillips and his accomplices, toward a system that saw an elderly black woman as someone to be manipulated and discarded. By the time Marcus finished his confession, I was no longer on the verge of tears. I was furious. "I think you should leave now," I said quietly. "Mom." "Now, Marcus. I need to think." He stood reluctantly. "I really am sorry, Mom." I looked at him, really looked at him. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved, the man who'd betrayed me. And despite everything, I still saw something worth saving. "I know you are," I said. "But being sorry isn't enough. Not this time." After he left, I sat in the growing darkness of my room, not bothering to turn on a lamp. The betrayal sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. I thought about my options, which seemed pitifully few. I could call Lydia, have her come down and raise hell. I could contact a lawyer, though what legal recourse I had wasn't clear, since Marcus had acted as my proxy with my permission. I could confront Phillips directly, but to what end? The simple fact was that I had been outmaneuvered. My home, my history, was about to be bulldozed, and I had been tucked away in this beige holding cell to live out my remaining days in supervised, sanitized comfort. That night, lying in my sterile room at Golden Sunset, I stared at the ceiling and realized something profound. I might be old. My body might be failing me. But I was still Eleanor Jenkins. And Eleanor Jenkins had never let injustice stand unchallenged. I just needed to figure out how to fight back. That night after Marcus left, I couldn't sleep. The weight of betrayal pressed on my chest, making each breath labored despite the oxygen flowing through my nasal cannula. I sat by the window, watching the stars emerge in the night sky, feeling the walls of my sterile room at Golden Sunset closing in around me. What Phillips, Marcus, the staff, what everyone here didn't understand about me was that I wasn't just the gentle old lady they saw shuffling down the hall with her walker. Before I was Principal Jenkins with her severe bun and reading glasses on a chain, before I was Reverend Jenkins' supportive wife in her Sunday best, I was Eleanor Davis, a skinny, determined girl from Crisp County, Georgia, with dirt under her fingernails and fire in her heart. I was the girl who'd grown up in the shadow of Jim Crow, whose parents were sharecroppers working the same land their parents had worked as slaves. The girl who'd picked cotton until her fingers bled, whose earliest memories were of heat shimmering off red clay roads and the constant, gnawing fear that came with being black in the rural South of the 1930s. I was the girl who'd walked 5 miles each way to the colored school, a one-room former tobacco barn with second-hand books and a leaky roof, because my grandmother had drilled into me that education was the only ladder that could take us higher than our circumstances would normally allow. They can burn our homes, they can threaten our bodies, but they cannot touch what's in here, she'd told me, tapping my forehead with her callous finger, unless you let them. My grandmother, Ida Mae Davis, had been born in 1871, just 6 years after emancipation. She'd seen night riders burn crosses. She'd known people who disappeared for looking a white man in the eye. She'd survived things I knew about only from the nightmares that sometimes made her cry out in her sleep. But she'd also taught me that survival wasn't enough, that dignity required resistance, even if that resistance had to be hidden. Appearing to go along with what they want, she'd say, doesn't mean surrendering who you are. It just means living to fight another day. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window. Grandma Ida. How I wish she could be here now, to tell me what to do. But perhaps she had already given me what I needed, years ago. I rose from my chair, moving carefully in the darkness to the small dresser where I'd placed the few personal items I'd brought to Golden Sunset. From the bottom drawer, beneath carefully folded handkerchiefs my mother had embroidered, I withdrew a polished wooden box about the size of my palm. It was cherry wood, worn smooth with age, its brass hinges tarnished almost black. Grandma Ida had given it to me on my 16th birthday. This belonged to my mother, she told me, who got it from her mother before her. When the time comes that you need to remember who you really are, open this. For 77 years I'd kept that box, moving it from place to place, always somewhere safe and private. I'd looked at it sometimes, run my fingers over its smooth surface, but I'd never opened it. Somehow, I'd always known when the right moment would come. This was that moment. I carried the box back to my chair by the window, where the moonlight would allow me to see without turning on a lamp that might attract attention from the night staff. With slightly trembling fingers, I opened the lid. Inside lay 3 items. A small iron key, clearly ancient, with an ornate bow and a surprisingly complex bit. A folded square of yellowed paper, and a smooth stone no bigger than a quarter, polished to a sheen that made it gleam in the moonlight. I picked up the paper first, carefully unfolding it. The handwriting was faded but elegant. Not my grandmother's hand, but perhaps her mother's or grandmother's. A single sentence. They can lock the doors, but they can't chain your mind. Next, I examined the key. It was heavy for its size, the metal worn smooth in places from generations of hands. I didn't know what lock it had originally opened. Perhaps the cabin where my ancestors had lived after emancipation, perhaps something else entirely. The key's purpose was symbolic now, a tangible reminder that freedom sometimes required opening doors others wanted kept shut. Finally, I picked up the stone. Unlike the other items, it had no obvious meaning, no inscription. Just a smooth, cool weight in my palm. I turned it over, puzzled, then noticed a faint discoloration on one side. What might have been dried blood, so old it had almost merged with the stone's natural variegation. Understanding dawned. This wasn't just any stone. This was a stone someone had picked up for protection, perhaps during a night when the clan rode through town, perhaps during some other moment of danger. A silent testament to the fact that sometimes survival required not just stealth and cunning, but the will to fight back when necessary. I held these 3 simple items in my weathered hands, feeling a strength flow through me. Not physical strength, but something deeper. The collective strength of generations of Black women who had faced worse odds than mine and had still managed to prevail. To protect what mattered. To pass down not just their genes but their unbroken spirit. I thought about what Phillips and the others saw when they looked at me. A frail old woman with a failing body. Someone to be managed and contained until death came to collect her. They saw my oxygen tank, my walker, my occasional confusion with technology. They saw my wrinkles and white hair and curved spine. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I carried within me the lessons of Grandma Ida and all the women before her. They didn't see my eyes, still sharp as razor blades, noticing everything. During my first 3 months at Golden Sunset, I'd already cataloged every staff member's routine, noted which doors were alarmed and which weren't, identified which rules were actually enforced and which were merely for show. I knew that Jenny, the night attendant, always dozed off around 12:15 while watching her medical shows. I knew that the camera in the east hallway had been broken for weeks, with a maintenance request that kept getting pushed back due to budget constraints. They didn't see my mind, still quick and strategic despite occasional lapses in short-term memory. I'd spent 42 years as a high school principal, managing hundreds of teenagers and dozens of teachers, navigating school board politics and community expectations. I'd learned to anticipate problems, identify weaknesses in systems, and find creative solutions with limited resources. Those skills hadn't disappeared just because I'd retired. They didn't see my hands, arthritic but still nimble from years of playing piano at church, from knitting, from gardening. Hands that Grandma Ida had personally taught to pick a simple lock when I was just 10 years old. "Why do I need to know this, Grandma?" I'd asked, practicing with the rusty padlock she'd given me. "Because sometimes, child, the people with keys don't want us to go where we need to go," she'd answered. "Sometimes freedom requires making your own way in." I'd thought it was just another of her peculiar lessons, a remnant of her hardscrabble upbringing. I never imagined I'd use that skill in my 90s, plotting an escape from a retirement home. But here I was. I carefully replaced the items in the wooden box, except for the key, which I slipped into the pocket of my robe. Not because I needed it for any physical lock. The service entrance at Golden Sunset used a much more modern locking mechanism, but as a talisman, a reminder of who I was and where I came from. With newfound resolve, I began to plan. First, I needed to understand exactly what was happening with my house and the proposed expansion. For that, I needed access to information that wouldn't be willingly shared with me. I needed to get outside these walls. Over the next 3 days, I became the model resident. I smiled pleasantly at Phillips when he checked on me, expressing contrition for my emotional outburst. I participated in group activities with a docility I hadn't shown before. I even befriended Myrtle Wilson, a white woman about my age who served on the resident council, and was known to be Philip's favorite, his eyes and ears among the residents, as some put it. All the while I watched. I listened. I made mental notes of times, patterns, vulnerabilities in the system. The night attendant, Jenny, was young, perhaps 25, working the graveyard shift to put herself through nursing school. She was kind but chronically exhausted, often fighting to stay awake during the quietest hours between midnight and 4 a.m. She always did her required rounds at 11 p.m., and then again at 5 a.m., but the hours between were spent at the nurse's station, where the flickering light of the television kept her company. The service entrance, located near the kitchen at the back of the facility, was used primarily by staff and delivery people during the day. After 10 p.m., it was locked but not alarmed, an oversight in security that I guess was due to the frequent smoke breaks taken by the kitchen staff during their shifts. Most importantly, I learned from casual conversation with the weekend janitor, a talkative man named Lewis who had no idea how revealing his anecdotes were, that the resident tracking system Phillips often touted as a safety feature was largely for show. The bracelets we were all required to wear would indeed trigger an alarm if we left through the main entrance, but the system had never been properly extended to the service areas due to budget constraints. Between you and me, Lewis had confided while mopping the hallway outside my room, half the so-called security around here is smoke and mirrors. Mr. Phillips talks a big game to the families, but when it comes to actually spending money on upgrades, he'd made a dismissive gesture with his hand. Armed with this knowledge, I formulated my plan. The night after my conversation with Lewis, I went to bed early, setting my alarm clock for 11:45 p.m. I dressed carefully in dark clothes, not black, which would look suspicious if I were spotted, but navy blue, which would blend into shadows while still seeming like something an elderly woman might naturally wear. I tucked my oxygen canister into a small rolling bag that made far less noise than my usual walker with its attached tank. At precisely 11:50 p.m., I emerged from my room. The hallway was dim, illuminated only by the safety lights near the floor. I moved slowly but deliberately toward the east corridor, the one with the broken camera. From there, it was a short distance to the service area. As anticipated, Jenny was at her station, already drowsy as she watched her show. The television's glow illuminated her face, but her eyes were half-lidded. She didn't notice as I slipped past, keeping close to the wall. The service entrance door had a simple push-bar mechanism from the inside, with a keypad for re-entry. The lock wasn't the challenge. It was ensuring the door didn't make noise when I opened it. I prepared for this, bringing along a small tube of petroleum jelly from my toiletry kit to apply to the hinges. This wasn't my first act of careful rebellion. As a young teacher in the 1950s, I'd surreptitiously used the whites-only library after hours, borrowing books through a sympathetic janitor and returning them before dawn. During the civil rights movement, I'd quietly provided safe houses for organizers passing through our area, all while maintaining my public image as the respectable teacher who didn't get involved in politics. Even as principal, I'd found ways to circumvent racist school board policies, channeling resources to black students whom the system was designed to overlook. I'd learned long ago that sometimes justice required working around the rules, not within them. The door opened silently. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in months, I felt the simple freedom of being outside without supervision, without sign-out sheets, without someone hovering nearby in case I fell. That first night I slipped out of Golden Sunset after midnight wasn't as difficult as one might expect. The night attendant dozed off right on schedule. The service entrance lock offered no resistance. And no one, not one person in that entire facility, expected a 93-year-old woman with oxygen and a walker to attempt an escape. Which is exactly why I succeeded. Standing outside in the moonlight, I took a deep breath, as deep as my compromised lungs would allow, and felt a smile spread across my face. Grandma Ida would have been proud. I was still Eleanor Davis underneath it all, resourceful, determined, and unwilling to accept injustice without a fight. Now I just needed a taxi to take me to my old house. I had some investigating to do. The taxi driver who picked me up that first night was a middle-aged Somali man named Hakeem. When I gave him the address of my old house, he raised his eyebrows at me in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am, it's nearly 1 a.m., he said gently. "Are you sure about this address?" I met his eyes steadily. "Young man, I may be old, but I know exactly where I'm going and why." Something in my tone must have convinced him. He nodded and pulled away from the curb where I'd waited, half hidden behind a decorative shrub near Golden Sunset's service entrance. "You remind me of my grandmother," he said as we drove through the quiet streets. "She never explained herself to anyone either." I smiled at that. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "The wisest," he agreed. "She raised 8 children during a civil war, kept them all alive and educated. Nothing scared her." "Fear is a luxury some of us can't afford," I said, watching the familiar neighborhoods pass by outside the window. Hakeem nodded thoughtfully. "May I ask why you're going to this address so late?" I considered how much to share. "That house is mine," I said finally. "Or it was until recently. I need to see what's happening to it." He didn't press further, and we rode in companionable silence until we reached Maple Street. Hakeem slowed as we approached my house, and I felt my heart clench at the sight of it. Even in the darkness, I could see that something was wrong. Construction lights blazed inside and out, illuminating a dumpster in the driveway filled with debris. The beautiful oak tree Thomas and I had planted on our 10th anniversary, now towering and majestic, had yellow tape wrapped around its trunk, the kind that marked things for removal. "Wait here," I told Hakeem, reaching for the door handle. "Ma'am, I don't think." "I'll pay you to wait," I said firmly. "Double the meter rate." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll wait. But please be careful." I stepped out of the cab, grateful for the rolling bag that disguised my oxygen tank as ordinary luggage. Moving carefully across the yard I'd tended for 60 years, I approached the house from the side, staying in the shadows cast by the hedge that separated our property from the Wilsons' next door. The front door stood open, harsh work lights spilling out onto the porch. I heard voices inside, men talking, laughing, the occasional sound of something heavy being moved or demolished. Working construction at 1 a.m. wasn't just unusual, it was almost certainly illegal. The city had strict noise ordinances about construction hours. I crept closer, staying out of the light. From my vantage point near the side window, I could see into what had once been our living room. The beautiful built-in bookshelves Thomas had crafted were being ripped out, the hardwood floors already torn up, exposing the subfloor beneath. A man in a hard hat directed 2 others who were taking measurements along the far wall. "We'll need to remove this entire load-bearing wall," he was saying. "Once we connect to the new wing, this whole section becomes a hallway." "Gonna need permits for that," one of the others replied. The first man laughed. "Philip says not to worry about permits. Says it'll all be retroactively approved once the council vote goes through next week. And if it doesn't, it will. Phillips has 3 members in his pocket, and only needs 1 more. Guess money talks even in a dump like Millfield." I felt sick. They weren't just planning to tear down my home for the Golden Sunset expansion. They were already doing it, before the zoning vote had even happened. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal on multiple levels. I pulled out my smartphone. The latest model my granddaughter Zoe had insisted I learn to use, complete with a case that attached to my wrist, so I wouldn't drop it. "Grandma," she'd said, "if you're going to insist on living independently, you need to be able to call for help anytime." The irony that I was now using it while escaping from supervised care wasn't lost on me. I opened the camera app and began taking pictures of the illegal work, making sure to capture clear images of the men's faces as well as the construction. I had just switched to video recording when one of them looked up sharply. "Hey, did you hear something outside?" I froze, pressing myself against the side of the house, grateful for the navy blue clothes that helped me blend into the shadows. "Probably just raccoons," another worker replied. "This old neighborhood's full of 'em. I'm gonna check anyway." Heavy footsteps approached the front door. I held my breath, calculating whether I could make it back to the taxi without being seen. The footsteps paused at the door, and I heard the distinctive flick of a cigarette lighter. The worker had just stepped out for a smoke break. Small blessings. While he was distracted with his cigarette, I carefully made my way back along the hedge line, staying low despite the protest from my arthritic knees. When I reached the street, I saw Hakeem watching anxiously from the taxi. He reached over and opened the door as I approached. "Everything okay?" he asked as I settled back into the seat. "No," I replied grimly. "But I got what I came for." I held up my phone. "Evidence." His eyes widened slightly, but he just nodded and pulled away from the curb. "Where to now?" I checked the time on my phone. Nearly 2 a.m. I couldn't risk staying out much longer. Morning checks at Golden Sunset began at 5, and I needed to be safely back in my bed before then. "Just drive around the block for a moment while I think," I told him. What could I do with the evidence I'd gathered? Going to the police seemed the obvious choice, but I wasn't naive. Construction permits, zoning violations. These weren't the kind of issues that typically inspired swift action from law enforcement, especially when powerful business interests and city council members were involved. By the time any investigation moved forward, my house might be completely demolished. As we circled the block, I found myself studying the houses we passed. Most were dark, their occupants asleep. But one caught my eye, a bungalow with lights still blazing despite the hour. In the driveway sat a car with the logo of the Millfield Chronicle on its door. "Stop here," I told Hakeem suddenly. The house belonged to Alice Tanner. She'd been one of my students back in the 90s, bright, inquisitive, with a nose for inconsistencies that had sometimes gotten her in trouble, but had ultimately led her to journalism. After college, she'd returned to Millfield to work for the local paper, eventually becoming one of their lead investigative reporters. "Are you sure about this, ma'am?" Hakeem asked, clearly concerned about dropping an elderly woman at a stranger's house in the middle of the night. "I'm sure," I said, already reaching for my purse to pay him. "That's the home of a former student of mine. She's expecting me." A small lie, but a necessary one. Hakeem still looked doubtful, but he accepted the payment, plus a generous tip, and watched as I made my way up the short path to Alice's front door. I heard him pull away only after I'd knocked and the porch light came on. The door opened to reveal Alice, dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt from some music festival, her curly hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. It took her a moment to recognize me standing on her porch after 2 a.m. "Mrs. Jenkins?" Her eyes widened in shock. "What on earth?" "Alice, honey, I need your help," I said without preamble. "And I think I might have the story of your career." To her credit, Alice recovered quickly. She ushered me inside, sat me down at her kitchen table, and put on a pot of coffee without peppering me with questions. Only when she'd placed a steaming mug in front of me, "Decaf," she noted, watching my oxygen tank, did she sit down across from me. "Okay," she said, her reporter's notebook already open in front of her. "Start at the beginning." And I did. I told her everything, about Marcus's betrayal, about Philip's plans for Golden Sunset's expansion, about the illegal construction already underway. I showed her the photos and videos I'd taken, watching her eyes narrow as she recognized the ethical and legal violations. "This is big," she said when I finished. "Corrupt city officials, elder exploitation, illegal construction. But Mrs. Jenkins, how did you even get to your old house tonight? Aren't you a resident at Golden Sunset?" "I escaped," I said simply. Her eyebrows shot up. "You what?" "I escaped," I repeated. "And I'll continue to do so until this situation is resolved." A smile slowly spread across her face, the same mischievous smile I remembered from when she was 17, and challenging her classmates to question conventional wisdom. "Mrs. Jenkins, you are not what I expected to come knocking on my door at 2 a.m. She tapped her pen against her notebook. "The question is, what do you want me to do with this information? I can certainly write a story, but Phillips and his cronies might dismiss it as the ramblings of a confused old woman." I finished for her. "And by the time anyone investigates properly, my house could be gone." "Exactly." I thought for a moment. "What we need is more evidence. Concrete proof of who's involved and how deep this corruption goes." Alice nodded slowly. "That would mean investigating not just Phillips and Golden Sunset, but also the city council members who are supporting the rezoning." "Yes. And we'd need to find out if there are other properties being targeted. I doubt mine is the only one." This kind of investigation takes time, Alice cautioned. Weeks, maybe months. I smiled grimly. Then we'd better get started tonight. I have approximately. I checked the delicate watch that had been Thomas's last gift to me. 2.5 hours before I need to be back at Golden Sunset. That night marked the beginning of what would become the most unlikely investigation team Millfield had ever seen. A 93-year-old former principal, with an oxygen tank, and a 43-year-old investigative journalist with a penchant for staying up until dawn. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, our little resistance movement grew. There was Michael Chun, a lawyer who still remembered how I'd stood up for him when he was being bullied in my school, now a partner at one of the city's most prestigious firms. Pro bono. He'd insisted when I tried to discuss payment. I still owe you for believing in me when no one else did. There was Darius Williams, a city planner who'd grown up in my neighborhood and recognized the pattern of urban renewal projects that somehow always seemed to target predominantly black areas. He provided insights into the zoning process and quietly copied documents that were supposed to be inaccessible to the public. And most surprisingly, there was a growing group of my fellow Golden Sunset residents. Initially just Rosa Gonzalez and Walter Thompson, the other black residents, but eventually others who'd recognized the controlling, infantilizing nature of Philip's leadership and were eager to resist in whatever small ways they could. They created distractions during my escapes, accidentally spilled drinks on security cameras, and passed notes like teenagers in a decidedly adult rebellion. Night after night, I would slip out of Golden Sunset between midnight and 3 a.m. Sometimes I would meet with Alice to review her latest findings. Sometimes I would visit other elderly neighbors from my old community, who were also being pressured to sell their homes. Sometimes I would stake out city council members' houses, noting visitors who arrived suspiciously late or with envelopes that looked too thick to be ordinary mail. We uncovered a web of corruption that extended beyond Phillips, beyond Golden Sunset, to half the city council and several developers. Phillips' company, Sunset Care Incorporated, had shell companies that fed into larger real estate development firms. They were systematically erasing our historically black neighborhood under the guise of elder care and urban renewal, with kickbacks flowing to the officials who smoothed the regulatory path. Alice published her first article 3 weeks after my late-night visit. Not the full exposé, but a carefully crafted piece questioning the rapid expansion of elder care facilities in Millfield and raising concerns about construction practices. It was just enough to put Phillips and his associates on notice, without revealing how much we actually knew. The next day, construction at my house mysteriously paused. The vote on the zoning change was delayed for further community input. Phillips began scrutinizing the Golden Sunset residents more closely, especially me. "Miss Jenkins," he said, stopping by my room one morning with his clipboard and practiced smile. "How are you settling in? Any concerns about your care?" "None at all," I replied pleasantly, "though I do find it difficult to sleep sometimes. Old age, I suppose." "Insomnia can be concerning at your age," he said, making a note. "Perhaps we should adjust your evening medication routine." The threat was subtle but clear. I would need to be more careful. But the stakes escalated dramatically one night when I was photographing new documents at my old house. Alice had received a tip that paperwork was being removed from the site, possibly to destroy evidence of the illegal work. She couldn't go herself. Phillips knew her face now, so I volunteered. It was a risk, but a calculated one. At 2 a.m., the construction site should have been empty. I took a taxi as usual, asked the driver to return in 30 minutes, and made my way cautiously to the back door of my house. The door that still had the key hidden under a loose brick in the garden wall, a key that Marcus apparently hadn't thought to mention to the new owners. Inside, the house was eerily quiet and drastically changed. Walls had been removed, floors torn up, fixtures stripped away. It barely resembled the home I'd loved for so many decades. Fighting back the grief that threatened to overwhelm me, I focused on my task, locating any documents that might have been left behind. In what had once been Thomas's study, I found what I was looking for: a filing cabinet partially hidden by construction tarps. The drawer was locked, but the cabinet itself was cheap metal, easily manipulated. Another skill from Grandma Ida's unorthodox education came in handy, as I used a hairpin to trigger the locking mechanism. Inside were folders containing what looked like original permit applications, complete with dates that had been altered and signatures that appeared to be forged. I carefully photographed each page, making sure the images were clear enough to read the fine print. I was so absorbed in my task that I didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost upon me. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding me. "Hey, who's in here?" a male voice called out. My heart thundered in my chest. I hadn't anticipated security guards. The construction site hadn't had them before. I quickly closed the drawer and looked for an escape route, but the flashlight beam had already found me, illuminating my face and my oxygen tank. The security guard was young, perhaps in his early 20s, and looked as surprised to see me as I was to see him. "Ma'am," he said uncertainly, clearly not expecting to find an elderly black woman with an oxygen tank rifling through filing cabinets at 2 a.m. I decided honesty might be my best defense. "This is my house," I said simply. Or it was until recently. Confusion crossed his face. "Your house? But Mr. Phillips said this property was purchased from my son, who had no right to sell it." I finished for him. "Young man, there's a lot happening here that isn't what it seems." I could see him processing this, trying to reconcile the frail old woman before him with the trespasser he was supposed to apprehend. Before he could decide what to do, another figure stepped from the shadows behind him. Director Phillips himself. The shock of seeing him there, at my house at 2 a.m., momentarily rendered me speechless. Phillips had no legitimate reason to be at a construction site at this hour, unless he was checking on something he didn't want others to see. "Well, well," he said, his usual smooth voice hardened with anger. "Miss Jenkins. I had a feeling someone was snooping around, but I never imagined it was you." The security guard turned, startled by Phillips' sudden appearance. "Sir, I just found her." Without warning, Phillips struck the young man across the back of the head with something heavy, perhaps a flashlight or tool. The guard crumpled to the floor with a muffled groan, then lay still. Phillips turned to me, his face twisted with rage and something worse, recognition. He'd pieced it together. My nighttime absences, the newspaper article raising questions, the sudden scrutiny from the city planning department. "I knew someone was interfering with my business," he snarled. "But I never imagined it was you, you interfering old." He stopped himself, visibly regaining control. His features smoothed into that patronizing smile I'd come to hate, though his eyes remained cold. "Miss Jenkins, you're confused, aren't you? Wandering at night is a sign of dementia. We should get you back to Golden Sunset. In fact, I think it's time we discussed moving you to our memory care unit. For your safety, of course." The security guard lay motionless on the ground between us. Phillips took a step toward me. I raised my phone. "I've been recording since I arrived," I lied smoothly. "Including what you just did to that young man. One button, and this goes to both the police and my reporter friend." He froze. I saw the calculation in his eyes, weighing whether a 93-year-old woman could really be a threat, whether I was bluffing about the recording, whether he could overpower me without further incriminating himself. "No one will believe you," he finally said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. A confused old woman making wild accusations? Against a respected business owner? "Perhaps not," I conceded. "But they'll certainly have questions about why you're here at 2 a.m., with an unconscious security guard at your feet and construction that violates at least 5 city ordinances." I took a shaky breath, fighting to keep my oxygen levels steady. "Now step aside, young man. I'm going home." And remarkably he did. But the look in his eyes as I passed told me everything. This wasn't over. He would be watching me now, waiting for me to make a mistake. The phone in my pocket felt as heavy as a brick. I hadn't actually been recording, but the photos I'd taken of the documents were perhaps even more damning. As I limped across the lawn, I heard the security guard beginning to stir. At least Phillips hadn't killed the poor young man. I made a mental note to have Alice check on him anonymously, maybe offer him protection if he was willing to testify about Phillips' assault. My taxi was waiting at the curb, Hakeem's familiar face a welcome sight. As we drove away, I glanced back at my beloved home, now a partially gutted construction site, and saw Phillips standing in the doorway, watching me leave. His posture was rigid with fury, his hands clenched at his sides. The personal conflict I'd begun had just escalated into something far more dangerous. Phillips now knew who his enemy was, not just an abstract someone interfering with his plans, but me specifically. And I knew just how far he was willing to go to protect his interests. This was no longer just about saving my house or exposing corruption. It was about survival. Because a man who would assault a security guard without hesitation wouldn't think twice about ensuring a 93-year-old woman with health problems had a natural decline that ended with her conveniently silenced. The stakes had never been higher. And I had never been more vulnerable. Back in my room at Golden Sunset, I sat in the darkness, my oxygen machine humming softly beside me. The digital clock on my nightstand read 4:27 a.m. I'd made it back with barely 30 minutes to spare before the morning staff began their rounds. My heart still raced from the confrontation with Phillips, and my joints ached from the exertion of the night's activities, a sharp reminder that regardless of my spirit, my body remained that of a 93-year-old woman with chronic health issues. I carefully removed the memory card from my phone and slipped it into a small pill container I kept in my jewelry box. The photos of the altered documents were too valuable to risk losing if Phillips decided to confiscate my phone. Then I changed into my nightgown, wiped away my minimal makeup, and mussed my silver hair to look as though I'd been sleeping. As I slid between the sheets, I realized the game had changed. Phillips would be watching me now, waiting for me to slip out again, possibly even manufacturing evidence of mental decline to discredit me. My previous approach, simply sneaking out at night, would no longer work. I needed to be smarter, more strategic. For the first time in my life, being underestimated for my age might become my greatest advantage. The next morning at breakfast, I made a show of being confused. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't aiming for an Academy Award, just small things that the staff would notice. I put salt in my coffee instead of sugar. I called one of the aides by another's name. I stared vacantly out the window for several minutes, ignoring questions until they were repeated, just enough to make the staff exchange those looks they think we don't see. The raised eyebrows, the subtle head shakes, the silent confirmations of their biases about elderly minds. "Miss Jenkins," said Nurse Brenda, touching my arm gently, "are you feeling all right this morning?" I blinked at her slowly. Oh yes, dear. Just tired. Didn't sleep well. Kept thinking Thomas was calling me. Thomas, my husband, dead these past 5 years. The mention of him brought exactly the reaction I'd expected. A softening of Nurse Brenda's face, a note made on her clipboard, and later, a call to my son. Marcus arrived by mid-afternoon, his face lined with worry. I was ready for him, sitting in my armchair with a blank expression, a photo album open on my lap to pictures from the 1970s. "Mom," he said, kneeling beside me, "the staff says you've been acting strange. Are you okay?" I let my eyes go vague, unfocused, before slowly turning to him. "Marcus? Is that you? What year is it?" The pain and guilt that flashed across his face was almost enough to make me stop the charade. Almost. But I remembered the look in Philip's eyes the night before, and I hardened my heart. "Should I call the doctor?" Marcus asked the hovering nurse. "Dr. Reynolds is already scheduled to evaluate her this afternoon," she replied, exactly as I'd anticipated when I'd started this performance. Phillips would want an official assessment of my mental state, ammunition for later. What none of them knew was that Dr. James Reynolds had been my family physician for 30 years. His own grandson had been caught with marijuana at my school, and I'd given the boy a second chance when others wanted him expelled. Some debts are never forgotten. When we were alone in the examination room 3 hours later, I dropped the act entirely. "Eleanor Jenkins," he said, shaking his head with a smile after confirming we weren't being monitored. "Still fighting the good fight, I see." "Need your help, James," I said simply and laid it all out for him. The corruption, the illegal construction, Philip's assault on the security guard, and my suspicion that they'd try to silence me by questioning my competence. When I finished, Dr. Reynolds was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What you're asking me to do, to certify you as mentally sound while letting them believe otherwise, could cost me my license if discovered. I nodded. I know. And I wouldn't ask if there were any other way. He sighed, then smiled faintly. My grandson just graduated medical school last month. Full honors. I heard. You must be very proud. I am. And I've never forgotten what might have happened if not for you. He reached for his prescription pad. Here's what we're going to do. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Officially, Dr. Reynolds would diagnose me with mild cognitive impairment. Nothing serious enough to revoke my autonomy, but enough to plant seeds of doubt about anything I might claim about Phillips or Golden Sunset. The diagnosis would come with a prescription for a mild medication that would, on paper, help manage my symptoms. But privately, he provided a second document, a sworn statement attesting to my complete mental competence, notarized and dated, to be kept by my lawyer. And the prescription he wrote was actually for vitamin B supplements, though the bottle would be labeled as the cognitive medication. If anyone checks the pills, they'll appear legitimate, he explained. And they might actually help your energy levels for these midnight excursions you seem so determined to continue. Thank you, James, I said, taking his hand in mine. I won't forget this. Just be careful, Eleanor, he replied, his expression serious. This Phillips character sounds dangerous. And regardless of how sharp your mind is, you are still an old woman with bad lungs. I finished for him. I'm aware of my limitations. He nodded, then raised his voice for the benefit of anyone who might be listening outside the door. So, Ms. Jenkins, I want you to take this medication twice daily. It should help with the confusion. And your son will need to check in with you more regularly. These conditions can progress rapidly at your age. I nodded meekly, playing my part. Thank you, doctor. I've been so frightened lately. Things just slip away. As Dr. Reynolds left, Phillips was waiting in the hallway, a show of concern masking his true interest. Doctor, how is she? He asked, as if he had any right to my medical information. Dr. Reynolds gave a performance worthy of his grandson's medical achievement. Mr. Phillips, I've diagnosed Ms. Jenkins with mild cognitive impairment, potentially early-stage dementia. Nothing unusual for someone her age, but something to monitor closely. Phillips' eyes gleamed with poorly concealed satisfaction. I see. Will this affect her reliability? If she were to make claims or accusations, for instance? Memory issues often affect perception, Dr. Reynolds said carefully. Patients might mix up names, dates, or imagine connections that don't exist. But Ms. Jenkins is not incompetent. She still has legal autonomy. Phillips nodded thoughtfully. Of course. We just want what's best for her. Thank you, doctor. That afternoon, I was officially diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. Nothing serious enough to revoke my autonomy, but enough to plant seeds of doubt about anything I might claim about Phillips or Golden Sunset. But what they didn't know was that my network was growing, and my strategy evolving. My granddaughter Zoe, Marcus's daughter, a recent law school graduate working at the Justice Department, heard about my cognitive decline, and came to visit the following weekend. Unlike her father, Zoe had inherited my stubbornness and analytical mind. Grandma, she said, after the obligatory small talk and once we were alone in my room. What's really going on? Because you were beating me at chess just last month. And your mind was razor sharp then. I studied her, this beautiful young woman with her law degree and her fierce sense of justice, and made a split-second decision to trust her. I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached for her phone. Who are you calling? I asked. Her smile was pure Jenkins family determination. My boss at the Justice Department. I think it's time the federal government took an interest in Golden Sunset's business practices. And that's when I knew we had a real chance. Not yet, I cautioned, laying my hand over hers. We need to be strategic. If Phillips suspects federal involvement, he might accelerate his plans or destroy evidence. Zoe put her phone down, considering. You're right. What do you suggest? We build our case methodically, gather irrefutable evidence, create a network of allies inside and outside Golden Sunset, and most importantly, we let Phillips think he's winning. Over the next month, Zoe became my most valuable asset. As a concerned granddaughter visiting regularly, she raised no suspicions. She brought me books, home-baked cookies, and, hidden among these innocent items, encrypted flash drives to store our growing collection of evidence, burner phones to communicate securely with our network, and legal documents for me to review and sign. Meanwhile, I continued my performance as an increasingly confused elderly woman. I would occasionally wander into the wrong room, forget staff members' names, and ask about long-dead celebrities as if they were still alive. I joined a memory support group at Golden Sunset, where I listened attentively as others shared genuine struggles, feeling a pang of guilt for my deception, but reminding myself of the greater good. Phillips seemed to take particular interest in my decline, often stopping by during meals or activities to observe me. Sometimes he would engage me in conversation, asking leading questions about my past or my understanding of current events, fishing for inconsistencies. I gave him just enough coherence to avoid more serious intervention, but enough confusion to reinforce his belief in my diminishing capacity. "Miss Jenkins," he said one afternoon as I sat in the common room, pretending to struggle with a simple jigsaw puzzle. "I heard you were quite an advocate for education in your day. Tell me, what do you think about the current school board's policies?" A trap. He was testing whether I could still follow current events and form coherent opinions. I deliberately placed a puzzle piece in the wrong spot before answering. "Schools are important," I said vaguely. "Children need to learn their letters. My Thomas always said education was the future." I looked up at him with artificially brightened eyes. "Have you met my husband? He's a pastor, you know." The satisfaction that flickered across Philip's face was almost comical. He believed he was witnessing my deterioration when in fact he was watching a masterclass in strategic deception, a skill I'd honed during decades of navigating white-dominated school boards and city politics as the first black female principal in our district. But Phillips must have sensed something was amiss, because security at Golden Sunset suddenly tightened. New cameras appeared in previously unmonitored hallways. The night staff was doubled. Residents' rooms were randomly searched for prohibited items like hot plates or candles, though mine seemed to be searched more frequently than others. My room was randomly searched twice in 1 week. My phone mysteriously disappeared, replaced with a simplified model, more appropriate for seniors, according to the apologetic staff member who delivered it. I was assigned a new nighttime nurse who checked on me hourly, making my former midnight escapes impossible. "They're watching me," I told Zoe during her next visit. "I can't get out anymore." Zoe nodded thoughtfully, helping me arrange flowers she'd brought, a cover for our serious conversation. "Then we adapt. If you can't go to the evidence, we bring the evidence to you." And that's exactly what we did. Zoe became our courier, bringing information from Alice, Michael, and our growing network of allies. Alice's preliminary reporting had connected us with a state investigator who'd been tracking similar cases of elder exploitation and real estate fraud across the region. The security guard who'd been assaulted by Phillips had recovered with only a minor concussion, and had come forward with his story after being contacted by Alice. Former neighbors began speaking out about the pressure tactics used to make them sell. Most surprisingly, some staff members at Golden Sunset began quietly joining our cause. Nurse Jenny, the night attendant I'd initially slipped past during my escapes, approached me one day while checking my vitals. "Ms. Jenkins," she whispered, "I overheard Phillips talking to someone about hiding documents. Said something about if the old Bats reporter friend kept digging, they might need to relocate certain paperwork." Jenny had grown up in my neighborhood, I learned. Her grandmother had been one of my students in the 1970s. "She always said you were the one who encouraged her to go to college," Jenny told me. "First in our family to get a degree." These connections, these ripples from a lifetime of treating people with dignity and fighting for what was right, became our greatest asset. To coordinate our growing coalition, we developed a system of coded communications. Flower arrangements from Zoe contained hidden notes. Book recommendations between residents actually conveyed meeting times or security changes. Even my apparent confusion became tactical. Mistakenly wandering into Philip's office allowed me to glimpse documents on his desk, and accidental encounters with specific staff members created opportunities for brief information exchanges. For nearly 2 months, I maintained the charade, growing increasingly frustrated as my nightly excursions were rendered impossible, but steadily gathering intelligence from within. We were making progress. The zoning vote was repeatedly delayed as questions around the development multiplied. The state investigation quietly gathered steam. Philip's business partners began to distance themselves as rumors of impropriety spread. Then came a breakthrough. Jenny, working an overnight shift, managed to photograph a document Philips had carelessly left in the copy machine. A letter from the Golden Sunset parent company expressing concerns about irregular financial activities and potential exposure to liability. They were getting nervous. The pressure was working. But Philips, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, grew more erratic and controlling. The memory care unit, a more restricted section of Golden Sunset where residents with advanced dementia lived under constant supervision, suddenly underwent renovations. New locks were installed. Staff assignments were shuffled. And Philips began suggesting to Marcus that my condition might be advancing more rapidly than anticipated. He wants to move you to memory care, Marcus told me during a visit, genuine concern in his eyes. He says it would be safer for you. I bit back my first response, that the only danger to my safety came from Philips himself, and instead clutched Marcus's hand with both of mine, playing my role. I don't want to move, I said, allowing my voice to quaver. I like my room. I still know things. The conflict on my son's face was painful to watch. He still believed my cognitive decline was real, and his guilt over selling my house had transformed into overprotective concern for my well-being. In his mind, he was making the best decision for a mother who could no longer decide for herself. Let me think about it, he finally said. Maybe we can get a second opinion. A reprieve, but likely a brief one. I needed to accelerate our plans. Through Zoe, I arranged an emergency meeting of our core team. Alice, Michael, Darius, and 2 others who had joined our cause. Councilwoman Henderson, who had finally found her conscience after witnessing Philip's increasingly unethical behavior, and surprisingly, Officer Paul Martinez from the Millfield Police. Martinez had initially seemed an unlikely ally. A 15-year veteran of the force, he had a reputation for by-the-book policing and skepticism toward claims of corruption. But he also had a grandmother in another Philips-owned facility across town. And our evidence of elder exploitation had struck a personal chord. We gathered at Michael's law office after hours, with me attending via a secure video call from Zoe's laptop in my room at Golden Sunset, the bathroom fan running to mask our conversation. Philips is getting desperate, I told them. He's trying to have me move to memory care, where I'll have no freedom of movement and no unsupervised visitors. Can we stop him legally? Alice asked, looking to Michael. Michael shook his head grimly. If Ms. Jenkins has been diagnosed with cognitive impairment, and her son consents to the move, there's little legal recourse in the short term. We could file for an independent assessment, but that takes time. Time we don't have, I said. The renovations to memory care will be complete in 3 days. I've heard staff talking. Officer Martinez leaned forward. Our investigation is making progress, but we still don't have enough for charges against Philips. The department wants ironclad evidence before moving against someone with his connections. What about the security guard's testimony? Zoe asked. It helps, but Philips' lawyer is already spinning it as a misunderstanding. Claims the guard tripped in the dark, and Philips was actually helping him, without corroborating evidence. I felt a familiar frustration rising. The powerful always seem to have more time than those they victimized. But then a thought occurred to me, a strategy so audacious it just might work. What if, I said slowly, instead of trying to keep me out of memory care, we use it as an opportunity? 5 faces stared back at me from the laptop screen, confusion evident. Philips thinks putting me in memory care will silence me, I continued. But what if it actually gives us access to the evidence we need? What if that's where he's hiding the most damning documents? Understanding dawned on Officer Martinez's face first. The renovations. Exactly, I said. I don't think they're renovating to improve patient care. I think they're creating a secure area for records they don't want found during an official investigation. That's actually brilliant, Alice said slowly. And it fits with something my source in city planning mentioned. The renovations Phillips filed permits for include a new administrative storage area within memory care. Unusual to mix administrative functions with patient care spaces. It's also a massive risk, Michael cautioned. Once you're in memory care, your communication with the outside will be severely restricted. If something goes wrong. I know the risks, I said firmly. But we're running out of options. Phillips is accelerating his plans, and we need those documents. Zoe looked deeply troubled. Grandma, no. There must be another way. I reached out as if I could touch her face through the screen. Sometimes the most direct path is through the fire, not around it. After much debate, a plan emerged, risky, complex, but with the potential to finally expose Phillips and his entire operation. I would allow myself to be transferred to memory care, where I would search for the hidden documents. Martinez would prepare for a police raid, timing it to coincide with a prearranged signal from me, delivered through a staff member who was sympathetic to our cause. The next morning, I told Marcus I was ready to move to the memory care unit if the doctors thought it best. The relief in his eyes was painful to see. He truly believed he was doing the right thing. Another burden to carry. Another fracture in our relationship that might never fully heal. 2 days later, I was officially transferred to Golden Sunset's memory care unit. Phillips himself came to oversee the move, his solicitousness barely masking his triumph. "You'll be much safer here, Ms. Jenkins," he said as an aide wheeled me into my new room, smaller, with fewer personal items permitted, and a door that locked from the outside. No more wandering at night. No more confusion about where you are or who's caring for you. I gazed up at him with deliberately unfocused eyes. "You're very kind. Have we met before?" The smile that spread across his face was genuine in its malice. "Several times, Ms. Jenkins. I'm Director Phillips. I run Golden Sunset." "Oh, that's nice," I murmured. "My sunset years. Thomas always said we'd have beautiful sunsets together." Phillips patted my hand condescendingly. "Rest now. The nurse will bring your medication soon." As he left, locking the door behind him, I permitted myself a small, grim smile. The game wasn't over. It was just moving into its final, most dangerous phase. For 3 days, I maintained my performance as a confused elderly woman, while carefully observing the memory care unit's routines, security measures, and staff patterns. The renovation work was indeed complete, but one area remained off-limits even to most staff. A new room at the end of the East Corridor, marked storage, authorized personnel only. On the 4th night, during the quietest hours when staffing was minimal, I enacted the next phase of our plan. Using a hairpin Zoe had smuggled in inside a box of tissues, I carefully picked the simple lock on my door. Another skill from Grandma Ida that was proving unexpectedly valuable in my advanced years. The hallway was dimly lit, with only emergency lights glowing at floor level. I moved slowly, my oxygen tank wheeled silently beside me, listening for any sound of staff. The night nurse was stationed at the central desk, but I knew from observation that she took a break around 2 a.m., usually stepping outside for a cigarette. I made my way toward the restricted storage room, keeping close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. When I reached the door, I examined the lock, more sophisticated than my room's, but still manageable with the tools Zoe had provided. It took nearly 10 minutes of careful manipulation before I heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Heart pounding, I eased the door open and slipped inside. The room was small but packed with filing cabinets and boxes. A desk sat in one corner with a computer and printer. This was no ordinary storage room. This was an office deliberately hidden within the memory care unit, where visitors were restricted and residents were assumed to be too confused to notice or report anything unusual. Working quickly, I began examining the files, using the small pen light Zoe had included with her lockpicks. In the third cabinet, I found what we'd been searching for: financial records showing transfers between Golden Sunset's parent company and shell corporations owned by city council members, original construction documents with forged signatures, and most damning of all, a list of elderly residents who had been systematically pressured into selling their properties, with notes about which ones had family members who could be incentivized to cooperate. My name was on that list, with Marcus's financial troubles detailed in clinical notation. These records were the smoking gun we needed. I carefully photographed each crucial document with the small camera Zoe had smuggled in, disguised as a large button on my sweater, making sure the images were clear enough to be legible. I was so focused on my task that I almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching in the hallway. Hastily replacing the files, I moved toward the door, but it was too late. The footsteps had stopped outside. The door swung open, flooding the room with light from the hallway. And there stood Phillips, his expression transforming from surprise to rage as he registered my presence and what I had been doing. "You," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with venom. "I knew there was something wrong about your convenient decline. You've been faking all along." Behind him, I could see the night nurse, looking confused and alarmed. "Mr. Phillips? What's happening?" Phillips didn't take his eyes off me. "Nothing, Nurse Chun. Ms. Jenkins is having one of her confused episodes. I'll handle this. Go back to your station." She hesitated, her gaze moving between us, clearly sensing the tension. "Are you sure? She shouldn't be out of her room at this hour." I said I'll handle it. Phillips snapped, his composure slipping. Nurse Chun backed away reluctantly, but I noticed she didn't return to the nurse's station. Instead, she lingered at the end of the hallway watching. Phillips stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You've been quite the problem, Ms. Jenkins. Far more resourceful than I gave you credit for." His voice was quiet, controlled, but vibrating with anger. "But it ends tonight." I stood as straight as my curved spine would allow, refusing to be intimidated despite the fear coursing through me. "It does indeed end tonight, Mr. Phillips. But not the way you think." "Oh." His smile was cold. "And how exactly do you plan to stop me? You're a 93-year-old woman locked in a memory care unit where no one will believe anything you say, where your own son has signed papers confirming your diminished capacity." "That may be true," I acknowledged. "But I'm not alone." His laugh was dismissive. "Your little network of meddlers? We know all about them. Your reporter friend's editor has already received threats of a lawsuit that would bankrupt their paper. Your lawyer grandson can't do anything without evidence that would stand up in court." He gestured around the room. "Evidence that stays right here." I remained calm, though my heart was racing dangerously fast. "You seem very confident for a man about to lose everything." Something in my tone must have given him pause. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "What are you talking about?" I smiled, channeling every ounce of Principal Jenkins' authority that had once made teenagers quake in their boots. "Did you really think I would come in here without a backup plan? Every document I just photographed has already been transmitted to multiple secure locations." It was a bluff. The camera had no transmission capabilities, but Phillips wouldn't know that. His eyes darted to my sweater button. That's not possible." "Modern technology is remarkable," I said smoothly. "Almost as remarkable as the arrogance that made you think you could steal an entire neighborhood and get away with it." Philip's composure was crumbling. He took a step toward me, hands clenched into fists. "Give me that camera. Now." I stood my ground. "Or what? You'll assault another elderly person? Add more charges to the growing list against you." For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me. His face contorted with rage, calculating the risks, weighing how much he could still salvage if he silenced me now. Before he could decide, the door swung open behind him. Nurse Chun stood there, but she wasn't alone. Officer Martinez was with her, his expression grim. "Director Phillips," Martinez said, his voice professionally neutral. "Step away from Ms. Jenkins, please." Phillips froze, then slowly turned. "Officer? What's the meaning of this intrusion? This is a private healthcare facility." "We received a call about a potential disturbance," Martinez replied. "And now I find you in a restricted area after hours with a resident who appears to be in distress." "Ms. Jenkins wandered out of her room," Phillips said smoothly, regaining his composure. "I was just about to escort her back. She's suffering from dementia, you know." "Is that so?" Martinez turned to me. "Ms. Jenkins, do you know who I am and why I'm here?" I straightened my shoulders. You're Officer Paul Martinez of the Millfield Police Department. You're here because Nurse Chen called you after observing Director Phillips following me in a threatening manner. Martinez nodded. And can you tell me what day it is today? Tuesday, April 12, 2022. Approximately 2:30 in the morning, I'd estimate. Phillips' face drained of color as he realized his dementia patient narrative was collapsing in real time. Officer, this is absurd, he blustered. Ms. Jenkins has occasional moments of clarity, but she's been diagnosed with cognitive impairment. Ask her son. We have a sworn statement from Dr. James Reynolds attesting to Ms. Jenkins' full mental competence, Martinez interrupted, as well as an explanation of why he provided a false diagnosis under duress. Phillips backed up a step. You can't possibly. We also have testimony from 8 other residents about systematic exploitation, statements from former employees about document falsification, and as of 20 minutes ago, Martinez checked his watch, a warrant to search these premises, with particular attention to this newly renovated storage room. The sound of multiple footsteps in the hallway confirmed his words as additional officers arrived. Phillips seemed to physically shrink before my eyes, the powerful, intimidating figure reduced to a cornered man seeing his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. This is all a misunderstanding, he said weakly. A business dispute blown out of proportion. Save it for your attorney, Martinez replied, nodding to another officer who stepped forward with handcuffs. Director Phillips, you're under arrest for assault, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights were read and Phillips was led away, Nurse Chen came to my side, supporting me as my knees finally gave way with the release of tension. You okay, Ms. Jenkins? She asked softly. I am now, I replied, watching as officers began carefully cataloging and removing the damning documents I'd discovered. I am now. The most dangerous phase of my plan had succeeded, but the game wasn't quite over yet. There were still battles ahead. Legal proceedings, recovery of properties, reconstruction of a community. But for the first time since I'd discovered Marcus's betrayal, I felt hope blooming in my chest. Phillips had underestimated me, just as so many had throughout my life. He'd seen an old woman with an oxygen tank and assumed weakness. He'd failed to understand that 9 decades of living hadn't made me fragile. They'd made me formidable. As Officer Martinez helped me back to my room, my temporary room, I reminded myself, already planning my exit from Golden Sunset. He shook his head in amazement. Ms. Jenkins, I've been a cop for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. A 93-year-old woman bringing down an entire criminal enterprise from inside a memory care unit? That's something else. I patted his hand where it rested on my wheelchair. Officer Martinez, one thing you learn in 93 years of living: never count out the old folks. We've got more fight in us than anyone suspects. We know, Officer Martinez said again, still not meeting my eyes. I set down my teacup with as much dignity as I could muster. Then you'd better come in and tell me exactly what it is you think you know. He hesitated before sitting on my sofa. Too young for the weight in his eyes, I thought. Reminded me of some of my former students, the ones who'd seen too much too soon. We followed you last month, he said. January 15th. You left Golden Sunset at 12:37 a.m. Took a cab to your old house. Met with 4 other individuals. I kept my face carefully neutral, though my mind was racing. January 15th had been my last excursion before security tightened. The night we'd gathered final evidence for the state investigator. Dementia patients often return to familiar places, I said mildly. Martinez finally looked at me directly. Ms. Jenkins, please. We both know you're not suffering from dementia. Something in his tone gave me pause. He wasn't speaking with the accusatory edge I'd expected. If anything, he sounded respectful. We've been investigating Director Phillips for 6 months, he continued. Financial crimes, elder abuse, conspiracy. But he's careful. Connected. We haven't been able to get enough to bring charges. Understanding began to dawn. So you followed me. Because somehow a 93-year-old woman was gathering better intelligence than our entire department. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I have to admit, Ms. Jenkins, I was impressed by your methodology. I allowed myself a small smile in return. In my experience, officer, people tend to underestimate those they've already dismissed. Clearly. He leaned forward. Here's the situation. Tomorrow morning, Phillips is holding a press conference announcing the City Council's unanimous approval of the Golden Sunset expansion. He's already hired contractors to begin full demolition of your former property the day after. My heart sank. After everything, we'd still failed to stop him. But, Martinez continued, watching me closely, we believe we now have enough evidence to move against him and his associates. Thanks in no small part to the documentation you and your network have compiled. Hope flickered. So you're here too. A sharp knock at my door cut me off. Without waiting for a response, Director Phillips strode in, flanked by two of his security staff. Officer Martinez, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. Thank you for alerting us to Ms. Jenkins' condition. As I mentioned on the phone, we've been very worried about her declining mental state. Martinez stood slowly, his expression unreadable. Director Phillips. Phillips barely acknowledged him, turning his attention to me. Ms. Jenkins, you've had everyone quite concerned with your nighttime wanderings. Fortunately, we've prepared a room for you in our secure memory care unit. For your safety. Panic fluttered in my chest. This wasn't right. Had Martinez betrayed us? Was this whole conversation a setup? Phillips gestured to his men. If you'll help Ms. Jenkins to her new accommodation. I don't think that will be necessary, came a new voice from the doorway. We all turned to see my granddaughter Zoe standing there, elegant in her Justice Department suit, a folder tucked under her arm. Behind her stood two more police officers and a woman in a business suit I didn't recognize. Philip's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Family visits are scheduled between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m., Miss Jenkins. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to return tomorrow. Zoe stepped fully into the room. Actually, I'm here in my official capacity. She opened her folder and withdrew a document. Director Phillips, this is a federal warrant authorizing the seizure of all Golden Sunset financial records, communications, and contracts dating back 5 years. The woman in the business suit stepped forward. And this is a court order temporarily transferring operational control of this facility to state receivers, pending the outcome of our investigation into allegations of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Philip's face went blank with shock, then twisted with fury. This is absurd. You have no grounds. We have extensive grounds, Zoe interrupted coolly, including sworn testimony from 17 current and former Golden Sunset residents, documentation of illegal construction activity, evidence of kickbacks to city officials, and she paused, looking directly at me with a small smile. The complete untampered security footage from Golden Sunset for the past 8 months. That's when I saw it. The first flicker of real fear in Philip's eyes. What security footage? He demanded. Our system only stores recordings for 30 days. Not the system installed by your approved vendor, no, Martinez said, finally showing his hand. But the secondary system installed by our department during a routine safety inspection last summer records to an off-site server, including the cameras in your office, Director. The implications hung in the air. Everything Phillips had said, every threat made, every bribe offered, all captured and preserved. His face drained of color. I want my lawyer. Of course, Martinez said mildly. You can call from the station. As the officers moved to escort Phillips out, he suddenly lunged toward me, his composure completely shattered. You, he snarled. You did this. A senile old woman who should have just stayed in her lane and died quietly. I looked him squarely in the eyes as the officers restrained him. I may be old, Director Phillips, but I've been fighting against men like you, men who mistake power for righteousness, since before you were born. And I've outlasted every single one of them. The morning after Phillips' arrest, Millfield awakened to headlines splashed across every local news outlet, and even some national ones. Elderly Crusader exposes corruption ring, read the front-page headline of Alice's comprehensive article in the Millfield Chronicle, accompanied by a photo of me sitting regally in my armchair, oxygen tank beside me, my eyes clear and challenging. The story was explosive, a 93-year-old former principal who had escaped her retirement home at night to gather evidence of corruption, fraud, and elder exploitation. The piece detailed the systematic erasure of a historically black neighborhood under the guise of elder care and urban renewal, the complicity of city officials, and the determined resistance of an unlikely hero who refused to be silenced. My phone rang constantly that first day. Reporters from Atlanta, Chicago, New York. Former students calling to offer support. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. I need to turn this thing off, I told Zoe, who hadn't left my side since the arrest. My old heart can't take all this excitement. She smiled, taking the phone from me. Let me handle this, Grandma. You've earned some rest. Rest was the last thing on my mind, though. There was still work to be done, justice to be fully secured. Phillips might be in custody, but his network remained largely intact, and the future of my beloved neighborhood hung in the balance. The fallout from the investigation was swift and comprehensive. By the end of the first week, half the city council had resigned, including Councilwoman Henderson, who had ultimately chosen to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency. The zoning board was placed under state oversight. Golden Sunset's parent company, Sunset Care Incorporated, saw its stock plummet as investigations expanded to their other facilities across 3 states. They're talking about a class action lawsuit, Michael Chen told me during a visit to my room at Golden Sunset, which now felt more like a war room than a prison. Every resident who was pressured to sell property, every family member who was misled about care conditions, they all have potential claims. I nodded, studying the maps and documents spread across my bed. What about my house? And the others already partially demolished? Michael's expression was grim but determined. That's more complicated. The construction has done significant damage, but we're arguing for restoration funding as part of the remediation package. The historical significance of the neighborhood works in our favor. The next month passed in a whirlwind of legal meetings, depositions, and community planning sessions, all convened in my room at Golden Sunset, which had become the unlikely headquarters of what local media had dubbed the Jenkins Revolution. The interim director who replaced Phillips treated me with a mixture of awe and wariness, clearly unsure how to handle a resident who had brought down his predecessor, and was now essentially running a legal campaign from her assisted living quarters. 43 days after Phillips' arrest, the first major victory came. My old house, what remained of it after the illegal construction, was designated a historical landmark, with plans to incorporate it into the community center that had been originally proposed before Phillips' scheme diverted the project. We should name it after you, suggested Councilman Williams, newly elected in a special vote after the corruption purge. The Eleanor Jenkins Community Center. I shook my head firmly. No. Name it after Thomas, if you must use our family name. Or better yet, name it after the neighborhood itself, Maple Street Community Center. This was never about me. It was about preserving something that belongs to all of us. The next breakthrough came a week later when the federal investigation, spearheaded by Zoe's department, secured indictments against not just Phillips but 12 other executives at Sunset Care Incorporated and 3 different development companies. The charges range from fraud and money laundering to conspiracy and elder abuse. They're offering Phillips a deal if he testifies against the bigger fish, Zoe informed me during one of our strategy sessions. His lawyers are advising him to take it. Will he? I asked, remembering the rage and entitlement in his eyes the night he was arrested. Zoe's smile was coldly satisfied. He already has. Turns out, principle matters less when you're facing 20 years in federal prison. Phillips' testimony opened floodgates of evidence against developers who had systematically targeted historically black and minority neighborhoods across the Southeast, using care facilities as a front for land grabs that displaced long-standing communities. The pattern was always the same. Identify neighborhoods with aging homeowners, establish elder care facilities nearby, pressure residents to sell through various tactics, sometimes targeting financially vulnerable family members like Marcus, then expand aggressively, often ignoring zoning regulations with the help of corrupted officials. The investigation expanded to 3 other states, triggering what one national news outlet called a nationwide reckoning on elder exploitation and community displacement. Through it all, I remained at Golden Sunset, partly because the case was still developing, partly because I needed the medical support, but mostly because I had unfinished business there. The other residents, many of whom had been kept in the dark about Philip's activities, deserved answers and advocacy too. 67 days after Philip's arrest, the former security guard he had assaulted, Luke Thompson, a 24-year-old working nights to pay for community college, stopped by to see me. "Miss Jenkins," he said, standing awkwardly in my doorway with a small potted plant in his hands. "I wanted to thank you. The settlement from Sunset Care is paying for the rest of my degree. I don't have to work nights anymore." I invited him in, noting how different he looked in daylight, without the security uniform, standing tall instead of crumpled on the floor of my old house. "What are you studying, young man?" "Social work," he replied. "I want to advocate for older adults. Make sure what happened here doesn't happen somewhere else." I nodded approvingly. "Good choice. We need more young people who understand that gray hair doesn't mean a blank mind." He smiled, then grew serious. "I should have done more that night when I saw how he was threatening you. I was scared of losing my job, but that's no excuse. You testified when it mattered," I assured him. "And now you're redirecting your life toward something meaningful. That's all any of us can do with our regrets. Use them as stepping stones toward better choices." As summer turned to fall, the legal proceedings continued, but my attention increasingly turned toward the future. A trust was established to ensure the community center would serve neighborhood children for generations to come. Funded partly by restitution from the companies involved in the scandal, and partly by community donations that had poured in after Alice's articles went viral. Architectural plans were drawn up that would preserve as much of the original houses as possible while creating modern, accessible spaces for after-school programs, adult education classes, and community gatherings. I insisted on a garden, not just decorative beds, but a working vegetable garden where children could learn about growing food, continuing the Victory Garden tradition Thomas and I had maintained for decades. 91 days after Philip's arrest, I finally moved out of Golden Sunset. Not back to my old house, that chapter was closed, the building now part of the developing community center. Instead, I accepted Zoe's invitation to move into her garden apartment, a small but elegant space behind her craftsman bungalow on the other side of town. Independence with a safety net, she called it, understanding her grandmother better than my own son ever had. I would have my own entrance, my own kitchen, my privacy, but help would be just a short walk or phone call away if I needed it. The day I left Golden Sunset, a line of residents and staff formed a farewell reception in the lobby. Many had tears in their eyes. Some had been part of my secret network. Others had simply been inspired by what one elderly woman could accomplish when everyone else had written her off. "You showed us all what's possible," whispered Rosa Gonzalez, one of the few who had known about my nighttime excursions from the beginning. "Reminded us we're not finished just because we're old." As I was wheeled toward the exit, I passed the wall where Phillips had hung his many photographs with politicians and business leaders, now replaced by community artwork and resident achievements. The culture of the place had already begun to shift under new management, with greater emphasis on resident autonomy and dignity. My son Marcus was waiting by Zoe's car to help with the transfer. Things between us remained complicated. He'd been devastated to learn how Phillips had manipulated him, using his financial vulnerabilities to target my property. The guilt had nearly crushed him. I hadn't fully forgiven him yet. Some betrayals cut too deep for quick reconciliation. But we were working toward understanding. He had been banned from my strategy sessions during the height of the investigation. Zoe's decision, not mine, though I hadn't objected. But in recent weeks, I'd allowed him to participate in some of the community center planning meetings. He came to see me a week after I'd settled into Zoe's garden apartment. Sat across from me at her kitchen table, unable to meet my eyes at first. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice low. "About what Phillips was planning. About the corruption. I just thought it was a good offer for a house that was too much for you to maintain anyway." I let the silence stretch between us, remembering the little boy who'd always taken the easy path, who'd grown into a man who did the same. In that moment, I saw not just his flaws but my own failure as a parent. Somewhere, somehow, I hadn't managed to instill in him the same moral compass that guided Zoe so unerringly. "I believe you," I said finally. "But not knowing because you chose not to look is still a choice, Marcus." He nodded, eyes still downcast. "I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. I know you are. And we'll work through this. But not today." I was tired, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes after a long battle. Today I need to rest. After he left, I sat on Zoe's porch swing, watching the neighborhood children play in the autumn sunshine. My oxygen tank hummed quietly beside me. My arthritic hands rested in my lap. To anyone passing by, I was just another elderly woman enjoying the afternoon. They couldn't see the fire still burning inside me. Couldn't know that at 93, I'd orchestrated the takedown of a corrupt system that had underestimated me at every turn. Couldn't guess that behind my wrinkled exterior lay the heart of a fighter who had never learned to surrender. 127 days after Philip's arrest, the court finalized the settlement agreement that would reshape both Golden Sunset and my old neighborhood. Every affected resident would receive compensation. The retirement home would operate under new management with strict oversight from state regulators. The community center project would receive full funding, with additional resources for affordable senior housing to be built on adjacent land. The day the settlement was announced, I received a package from an unexpected source. No return address, just a small box delivered by courier. Inside was an iron key, old ornate, the twin of the one my grandmother had given me all those years ago. With it was a note in unfamiliar handwriting. "Found this in the archives of First Baptist. Belonged to the first church building on Maple Street. Built by formerly enslaved people in 1867. Thought you should have it. A friend." I held the key in my palm, feeling its weight. The weight of history, of struggle, of persistence. My ancestors had built something from nothing in the years after emancipation. I had merely protected what was already there. The key seemed to whisper the same message my grandmother's had. They can lock the doors, but they can't chain your mind. 155 days after Philip's arrest, I attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the Maple Street Community Center. Using a specially designed walker that allowed me to stand independently for short periods, I joined the mayor, community leaders, and, most meaningfully, children from the neighborhood schools in turning the first shovelfuls of soil for the new project. Alice was there, of course, documenting everything. "They're talking Pulitzer for the series," Zoe whispered to me proudly. "First time the Millfield Chronicle has ever been considered." As I watched the children dig enthusiastically into the earth that had once supported my home, I felt a sense of completion. The house Thomas and I had fought to buy, had lovingly maintained, had raised our family in, it would continue to nurture and support generations we would never meet. Our legacy would live not in wood and plaster, but in opportunity and community. The national attention eventually faded, as it always does. Other scandals and stories took the headlines. But within Millfield, things had fundamentally changed. The city council now included representatives from every neighborhood, including 3 Black members from the historically underrepresented South Side. The Planning Commission had adopted new regulations specifically designed to prevent predatory development. And Golden Sunset, under its new management, had become a model for resident-centered care that emphasized dignity and autonomy. As for me, I settled into a new rhythm of life. Most days found me at the community center construction site, overseeing progress from a comfortable chair the workers had designated specifically as Ms. Jenkins' command post. I started a memoir, dictating my recollections to Zoe's laptop as my arthritic hands could no longer manage extended writing. I even reopened communication with some of the other Golden Sunset residents who had chosen to remain there, visiting monthly for what we jokingly called Revolutionary Seniors Tea Time. My health had its ups and downs. At 93, that was inevitable, but the oxygen tank and I managed well enough. Dr. Reynolds continued his house calls, marveling at my resilience. "You know," he told me during one visit, "there's medical literature suggesting that purpose and meaning contribute significantly to longevity. You might just outlive us all, Eleanor." I laughed at that. "Not planning on it, James. But I do plan on making whatever time I have left count." 212 days after Philip's arrest, Marcus arrived at my door with an envelope in his hand, and an expression I couldn't quite read. "What is it?" I asked, setting aside the community center blueprints I'd been reviewing. "The final paperwork from the settlement," he said, handing me the envelope. "And a personal note from Philip's lawyer." I opened the envelope with cautious curiosity. Inside was a formal letter confirming my portion of the settlement. A substantial sum that would ensure my medical needs would never be a financial burden on my children. And a smaller, handwritten note. "Ms. Jenkins," it read. "My client asked me to convey that while he cannot legally admit wrongdoing beyond what is in the settlement agreement, he wishes you to know that in his 30 years of business, no one has ever outmaneuvered him as thoroughly as you did. He underestimated you, to his considerable regret. With professional regards, Jonathan Bryce, ESQ." I smiled as I folded the note and returned it to the envelope. Not an apology, Phillips was too proud for that, but an acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the closest thing to justice we get in this imperfect world. Marcus watched me carefully. "Are you okay, Mom?" "I'm more than okay," I replied truthfully. "I'm vindicated." That evening, as Zoe prepared dinner in the main house, I sat on my small patio, enjoying the crisp autumn air. My phone buzzed with a text from Alice. "Community center opening date set for spring. Board unanimously approved naming the main reading room, the Jenkins Library. Non-negotiable," they said. "You did it, Mrs. J." I smiled to myself, thinking of my grandmother's key that still lay in my pocket alongside the newly discovered twin. Two keys representing the past and the future, the struggle and the triumph. Some nights now, I still slip out after Zoe has gone to bed. Not for investigations anymore, just to feel the night air on my face. To remind myself that freedom isn't just for the young, that resistance comes in many forms, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be who others expect you to be. And if the neighborhood patrol officer happens to spot me sitting on a park bench at 2 a.m., he just tips his hat respectfully and continues on his way, perhaps sharing the story later with his colleagues. The story of Eleanor Jenkins, the 93-year-old who disappeared every night, until the police followed her and discovered she wasn't lost at all. I was finding my way back to justice. On my 94th birthday, 6 months after the community center opened its doors, I sat in the Jenkins Library surrounded by children from the neighborhood, telling them stories of the old days. Not just stories of hardship and discrimination, though those needed to be remembered, but stories of resistance, resilience, and community. "Ms. Eleanor," asked a bright-eyed girl of perhaps 7, "weren't you scared when you sneaked out at night? My grandma says she'd be too scared to do that." I smiled at her, seeing in her face the same curiosity that had driven me throughout my life. "Of course I was scared, child. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It just means you do what needs doing anyway." "But how did you know what needed doing?" pressed a serious boy near the back. "How did you know you were right?" That gave me pause. How to explain to children the moral compass that guides a life? How to convey the certainty that comes not from arrogance, but from a lifetime of standing firm for what's right? "You know how a tree grows toward the light?" I said finally. "Even if there are obstacles, even if it has to bend and twist, it still reaches for the sun." People are like that too. Deep down, we know which way is toward the light. We just have to be honest with ourselves about the direction we're growing. As the children nodded thoughtfully, I gazed around the room that had once been Thomas's and my parlor, now filled with books and young minds. The walls we'd painted, the floors we'd polished, all transformed but somehow still ours. Still part of the legacy we'd built. In that moment, I felt Thomas's presence as strongly as if he were sitting beside me. I could almost hear his deep chuckle, the one that always emerged when life surprised him with unexpected blessings. "You did good, Eleanor," he would have said. "You kept on keeping on." And that, after all, had been the secret all along. Not dramatic heroics or grand gestures, but the simple, stubborn refusal to be diminished or silenced. The daily choice to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. One elderly woman with an oxygen tank and a walker. One lifetime of accumulated wisdom, and a fire that refused to die. One neighborhood saved, one corrupt system exposed, one community reborn. Vindication doesn't always come with trumpets and parades. Sometimes it arrives quietly, In children's voices echoing through rooms you thought were lost. In justice delayed but not denied. In the knowledge that you've left the world a little better than you found it. And sometimes, just sometimes, it comes when the police follow you at night and discover you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Standing firmly on the side of right, regardless of the cost.